Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very lucky today. I have the privilege of sitting in with Lord Cameron to really focus and delve into some of his advice, insights into growing a tech ecosystem. I have to say that the Tech City initiative that happened in London during Lord Cameron's tenure is one of the initiatives that we drew inspiration of from when we built Hub 71. Welcome, Lord Cameron.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. That wonderful introduction didn't include the fact that I am a visiting professor for New York University, Abu Dhabi, right here in Abu Dhabi. I was teaching here in 2023. I was interrupted to be Foreign Secretary, but I hope to be back in 25, 26 and onwards, and have always been incredibly impressed by what you've done here.
Appreciate that, Lord Cameron, and thank you also for visiting us a few years ago as part of that capacity. I'd like to start maybe picking your brain a little on your views in the tech economy in general. Why is it important today?
I think it's very simple, really. I mean, if you look at the biggest companies in the world today, a lot of them didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. So if your economic strategy is simply to get behind big companies you have today, you'll be successful, but you won't be truly successful because, of course, the startup companies are going to be the ones that are going to create the jobs, the investment, and the wealth for the future. And, you know, I still like to think I'm sort of relatively young, but I became leader of the Conservative Party 19 years ago. When I became a party leader, you know, the iPhone had not yet been invented. And you think what a massive change that has made to our lives. So if you want to be successful in this century, you've got to get behind startups, get behind tech, and design everything, not just your regulatory systems, but the way you run the country, the way you run the government, the priority you give to it. It has to become a real and continual focus, as it is here in Abu Dhabi, and that's what we really did with Tech City and Tech Nation back in 2010. We determined we were going to do everything we could to support it.
Fantastic, and that's a very fair statement when it comes to mobile phones. It did change the way we interact with the world. There are different technologies that are probably going to fuel that as well. But if we talk about the rise of Tech City, and especially in a place such as Abu Dhabi, where there are progressive regulators, what do you think were key policies that helped shape the success of Tech City?
I think that the first key policy is just the leadership that prime ministers can bring to this. Politicians often pick a subject, talk about it, and then move on. With this, if you really want to make a difference, you've got to set your path and keep coming back to it, and give everything you've got in your office in order to keep banging the drum, and then coming up with the policies, which obviously have got to include, you know, the speed of your connectivity. They've got to include the tax policies that you have to encourage venture. They've got to include the way you regulate, whether it's fintech or whether it's medical devices or biotech inventions, all of those things combined. And when I look back at Tech City and Tech Nation, I mean, first of all, it really was a success. You know, as was said in the introduction, we're the #2 city in the world for fintech after San Francisco. We went from something like 2 billion a year going into venture for fintech to 29 billion across a 10-year period. But one of the things I would say, though, is that we didn't just sort of invent it and centrally determine it. We were working with something that was already getting going. The phenomenon of Silicon Roundabout, of these startups, particularly in fintech in the city, was beginning to get going. What we did was get behind it and help to grow it with all the different policies we could bring to bear. And I think that's important. You know, I have to admit, we had some advantages. We had the English language. We had the fact we had the City of London, one of the world's great financial centers. We had excellent universities. We had a history of financing startups. So lots of the elements were there. It was about bringing them all together, bringing consistent and determined leadership to it, and then listening to the startups themselves. What is it you want? What sort of access to talent do you need? What sort of broadband speeds do you need? What sort of space do you need? How can we get big companies to help? When I look back, I think that was one of the things that made a big difference, was getting big banks, getting finance houses, getting some of the big tech companies like Google to come and locate training centers and offices in the place where we were trying to create this tech startup hub. And I think that made a difference too.
Yeah, of course, and it's testament, I think it was dozens, if not more, unicorns that came during that period of time. And I think one of the points you just mentioned was just on specifically talent and the importance of talent, especially when it comes to the startup scene, to the venture capital scene. It's early stage companies don't have track records. It's really focused on people, on talent. Obviously, London is a fantastic place to go. I know a number of the audience, I'm sure, goes a lot, including myself. What are the key initiatives that shaped attracting and retaining talent in London, especially in the VC side?
Well, I think there was two things. First of all, it was the EIS scheme and the seed EIS scheme. You've got to have a means for people who want to take a risk, to start something up, to raise money, in a way that the Treasury, the Finance Department, is always going to say, but that's going to cost a lot of money. That's a huge tax break for people that are investing in these startups. But it does pay back many, many times, but you have to have that courage to put it in place. And then on the talent, of course, we were lucky. We had, obviously the UK is a big economy. We had the access to the European market, but we also had entrepreneur visas that we introduced. And oddly enough, at the same time, we were trying to control overall levels of immigration with a cap on economic migration. And it's perfectly possible to do that at the same time as saying, but there's a particular bunch of people we want to attract in terms of entrepreneurs' visas. So access to talent, encouraging talent was incredibly important. There's one other thing I'd say, though, as well, kind of looking back at it, which is if your government simply says, we want to attract startups and tech to our country, but that is unrelated to the other things you do in government, it won't work. You've got to create, as you're doing here, create an atmosphere based on what you're doing across government. At the same time as saying, we want to get behind Tech City, we were also transforming government to make it more digital, to make sure that the online way the government worked was far better. And we became, I think in 2016, we were judged the best digital government in the world. It's got to link to what you're trying to do in terms of your biotech industries. And are you encouraging startups in healthcare? Are you encouraging startups in other parts, not just in sort of chosen areas? So it's the whole way your government is acting, I think, can help to create the atmosphere. And I'll give you one example of that, which is being open about data. A lot of the first companies that started up when we got this whole initiative going were based on the fact we were releasing huge amounts of data, health data, crime data, data about the success or failure of public transport. All that open data is incredibly valuable for creating apps and creating businesses. So you can't just have a tech startup policy, you've got to have a way of doing government that creates an ecosystem that shows you're serious about this.
No, and it's a beautiful segue to what the next topic I wanted to discuss. One of the challenges, a big challenge we faced when we started Hub 71 in 2019 was identifying that even though Abu Dhabi had great macroeconomic factors to help set up businesses, it was always this educational journey we had to make, and we continue to make, even though we progressed with the government entities, with corporates, to showcase the importance of working with startups, the importance of embedding innovation into these companies and entities. In terms of public-private partnerships, was there anything specific you were able to unlock to get them more excited about working with startups and innovation?
Yeah, I think the public-private partnerships were a big part of it, because things like Tech City and then Tech Nation, these were, government-backed, but essentially, private sector-led organizations. Because you need, if it's just government trying to do it itself, it will screw it up. You need to have experts who are really understand what makes an effective tech hub and tech startup culture, to be telling the government what they need. So I think that public-private partnership's incredibly important. But it does go back to what I said about it can't be on its own. If I think of some of the things that really made a difference, I mean, obviously Britain has particularly excelled in fintech. So I think we've got more fintech unicorns than anywhere else apart from America. And the level of investment into fintech in the UK is twice that in Germany, 3 times that in France. And you wouldn't be able to do that unless you were also regulating your financial services in a way that helped to enable fintech to happen. So I'd say the 2 biggest things there were the open banking regulations, where you're effectively saying to your banks they have to open up their data to other users. And also I think the concept of the regulatory sandbox, where you can try out new ways of doing things in a permissive regulatory environment. If you simply said, come and start up financial services businesses, but I'm not going to change the way I regulate the banks, and they're not going to change the way they behave, and I'm not going to change the way we do regulation, then it won't work. So it's making sure you're consistent across the piece, and it's those regulatory changes that are often the absolute key to the startup system. And one of the things I'm doing now is actually not fintech at all. It's involved in healthcare, where we've got this Oxford University Harrington Centre for Rare Diseases, and we want to use genomics to try and have 40 cures for 40 rare diseases. And one of the reasons I think we'll succeed is because, you know, a lot of the big American companies want to come to Britain because our regulatory system, they hope, and we've got to make sure it delivers, but they think our regulatory system will be faster at licensing treatments and drugs than the European system or the American system. So the regulatory system you have in place is absolutely crucial to the startup, the success of your startup ventures.
Fantastic. So out of curiosity, because something we go through, so we pride ourselves on having agile regulatory environment. You've met His Excellency Ahmed Zaabi, my chairman, earlier before. How long would it take for a new regulation that would support the startup ecosystem? How long would it take for it to flourish out of economy?
Well, I mean, one of the great advantages you have is the speed of getting things done here in this country is phenomenal, and I saw that. I mean, just this morning, I'm arriving at a different airport terminal to the one when I was here teaching 2 years ago. So your speed of getting things done, the nature of your government in terms of how fast it can act. In our country, no doubt about it, regulations take longer to change. But if you have a clear idea about where you want to get to, we can be nimble enough. Actually, something Daniel Ek from Spotify said at a meeting I chaired recently really struck me, because he was talking about the importance of how we regulate the big tech platforms and how we make sure we're encouraging the intellectual property right owners. And someone in the audience said, but you know, surely post-Brexit, Britain isn't really big enough to bother with how we regulate. And he said, no, you're quite wrong. He said, Britain is small enough to be nimble, but big enough to make a difference. And I think that's a good moniker for us to think about how we regulate in the modern world.
No, definitely. The airport is indeed different, though it did take a bit longer than what we originally expected, but great outcome. So it is a testament to, I'd say, outcomes, and which is something I want to also spend time with you on. What are the outcomes, now that looking back during that initiative, what are the outcomes that make you most proud?
Well, I think the fact that we've got, 29 billion, 30 billion a year in venture coming into British startups, the fact that so many jobs have been created, I think that's really encouraging, and it's definitely across. FinTech has been the biggest success story, but I think if you look at biotech, if you look at healthcare, if you look at green tech, educational technology, development, something where Britain and the United Arab Emirates work very closely together, is using technology to try and revolutionize the way we deliver aid. Yeah. That has been a success story. But I think, before we get too carried away, there's been a big failure here, which is that if you look at the biggest tech companies in the world, they are almost all American. Yeah. So we have helped to create some fantastic fintech companies like Revolut, for instance, now worth, getting on for $50 billion. Probably more, I probably got that figure wrong. Apologies to anyone from Revolut in the audience. Those are big success stories, but Europe and the United Kingdom, we haven't yet managed to grow one of the absolute giants, the Metas, the Googles, the Alphabets and such like. So, you know, we've still got our work to do, but I think the success is across all that range of startups, and you see it in the jobs. I think the other thing that's worked is it's not just London. If you look at the creation of unicorns in Britain now, you can see Cambridge, you can see Leeds, Manchester, Edinburgh. There's a lot of different cities with a sort of startup culture. And I think we have really changed the way our universities think about startup culture. I mean, compared with when I was at university, you know, almost 40 years ago, and how universities act today, they are absolute hubs of enterprise and buying into the startup culture, and also helping to scale up, because I think that's another area where, frankly, Britain has still got lessons to learn, is we create a lot of brilliant startups, they get to a certain size, and then they tend to get gobbled up or merged, rather than try to go all the way. There's a great example of one that's trying to go all the way at the moment, which is in the area of genomics, which I have a great interest in, which is Oxford Nanopore. That is determined to become a sort of UK-based champion in genomics.
Fantastic. You know that, speaking of the great outcomes you have and also the lessons learned, it's a great opportunity for me, selfishly, leading Hub 71 out of Abu Dhabi, to get advice and counsel from you on what should I be looking out for? What are things that I can do differently that will allow me to shape Hub 71 in the best way possible?
I mean, I think you've got so many of, I mean, I've enjoyed my visit to Hub 71, and you've got lots of the natural advantages that tech culture requires. You know, this is an incredibly successful country and economy that people want to live in. Culture is important. When I was teaching at NYU, I was living on Saadiyat Island, and there was the Louvre was built and up and running, the Guggenheim was on its way, the Sheikh Zayed Museum was being built. That matters, the livability of the city. I think the access to finance is incredibly important, and you've got some of the most forward-looking sovereign wealth funds and creative sovereign wealth funds and other investors here. I think the region you're in, the growth that's taking place, I think those are all incredibly important. I think the big lesson to learn is to think, what else can government do that creates platforms on which tech can build? So the genomics example is a really good one, where again, we did the first population genomics program, the 100,000 genomes program that I set up, sequencing children and parents with rare diseases, sequencing cancer, and then making that data available as an open platform for researchers to plug into, look at, and come up with cures and treatments and businesses. And again, in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, you're doing genomics, population genomics on a massive scale. But I think it's asking what else in government, in terms of our, you know, you're not going to have energy tech unless you have a flexible and progressive energy system. You're not going to have ed tech unless you've got great universities and innovation coming into your schools. You know, you're not going to have dev tech unless you're thinking about development in a way that isn't just simply, you know, giving aid from one country to another country. So it goes all the way across government. But in most of those areas, I think the UAE is a thought leader.
Amazing takeaways for me. Big data, very important.
Yes.
The role of government, as you saw in shaping the future, which we have found them. You have my commitment that at your next visit to Abu Dhabi, to Hub 71, you'll continue to see progress. Thank you for your insights, Lord Cameron. Very much enjoyed the session. And again, privileged to have spent time with you.
Thank you very much. I'll certainly come back to Hub 71. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.